Okay, folks, so this is to continue from the last video. And I had started sketching out and I was explaining to you guys about like vertical, horizontal axis, how to measure height to width, and then how to measure everything else to get your proportions, etc., etc. And clearly from the last video, you could tell that it didn't quite fit on the paper. I wanted to fit the entire still life, and you can see the entire still life here consists of the drapery and like four objects, and I couldn't quite fit from the last video. So what I did was I redrew it and shifted it, but I wanted to go through the steps that I took in order to fit the entire still life on my drawing, as well as how to construct the individual objects and to get the proportions right, etc., etc. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do is that depending on how complicated your still life is, I mean, it doesn't matter. You should obviously do thumbnail sketches, okay? Whether it's like, and that's basically what it is. You do little studies, whether it's portrait format or landscape format. This is portrait format. And you figure out what you want to capture. Here, what I've done is drawn the entire still life because it's only like four objects. Okay, so what you want to do is, from the last video, you notice that I used the smallest object in the still life, which is this container, as a unit of measurement, meaning I use this to measure everything else so that everything would be in proportion to one another. Okay, and so the main important thing to remember is this, that when you have a still life and see you pick the smallest object in there, and in this case is this container, this jar, and what I did was I figured out what the height is in relation to the width. Okay, so I used a stick or a pencil as a tool to measure what the height is and how it fits or how it compares to the width of that object. So in the last video, I found that it's 1 to 1. That means the height is the same as its width, okay? And because this container is slightly at a tilt, you need to measure parallel to the edge of the paper, this one, okay? So I would measure that with my pencil, the height, and then I would line it up with the width, and I found that it's 1 to 1. So having said that, then you can draw your object, you can scale it up or you can scale it down, meaning that if you know the 1 to 1 ratio, you can make this container huge so that it would fill up the entire paper, or you can make it really small, like really small, so that it would be like maybe 1 inch in size, okay? And you could scale it up or you could scale it down, and it would be proportionately correct because you know the ratio is 1 to 1, okay? Having said that, having done that, then after you've drawn it on your paper itself, you can use that, the height or the width, if you've got that ratio correct, 1 to 1, to measure the, say, the spray can or the cube and see what the proportion is. So you can use the height of that small jar and see how many times it fits into the spray can, so that you know that, okay, this would be in proportion to the jar, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you want to make sure that you get that initial object correctly, the smallest one, because then that could be used as a unit of measurement to measure everything else. You can use this jar to measure this, and once you've measured this, the height and the width, then you can use either the height or the width to measure the cube, and then you can use the cube after you've drawn it to measure this other container, and so on and so forth. Or you can use this to measure the jar, the initial jar, to measure everything else. Okay, everything would be proportionate to one another. So the other thing that you might have discovered while drawing is that sometimes you want to draw the entire still life, and then you realize, like what I did in the first video, that I started to draw, I didn't really measure out the whole thing, and then I realized I ran out of paper space. Like I couldn't fit the entire still life in there. How do you figure out, how do you make sure that you fit everything? Well, again, you take the smallest object in there, in this case is this jar, I find out what the height is, and then I see how many times it fits, or how many of that jar would fit vertically in the entire still life that I want to draw. So if I want to draw from the top of that still life where the drapery is, and all the way down to say like at the bottom, the edge of the table, I would use my stick or my pencil, and I would line it up with the the jar itself, that container, and I would find the height, and I would move it vertically down the still life. 3, 4, 5. So to me, it's like the height of that still life that I want to draw from the top where the drapery is to the edge of the table is 5 times the size of the height of the jar. So I would use this to fit. Okay? So then it will make sense that then you do the same thing with the width. How wide is the width in comparison to this container? So then you use the height, you turn it on its side, and you measure the width of the still life that you want to draw. And then you would draw accordingly. Okay. So what it is that if, for example, the height of the entire still life is say 5 times, and the width is 3 of that container, then you know that the format has to be a portrait format, a vertical format. Okay, so then I would use this. You would draw your object, your smallest object, and then say if you drew it this big, then you can use this and move it down the length of your paper to see whether it'll fit, and then do the same for the width of the paper so you know whether you could fit the entire still life in your drawing paper. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I think it might make more sense once you start doing it. Okay, so back to this drawing, what I've done is that I did this, I've shifted everything, and I've left the construction of the objects on the paper itself so that we could go through them one by one. Okay, these are things that you've learned in your drawing one. Okay, so height to width ratio, we find for the smallest object so that we could use the smallest object as a unit of measurement to measure everything else. Okay. The other thing that we've learned in drawing one would be like horizontal axis, vertical axis. Horizontal axis would be your x-axis, vertical would be your y-axis, and that would help you also to figure out your placement. So it's helpful that you take your stick or your pencil and you line up, say I lined up the edge of that container, and I see where it intersects on the cube. And so I'm using my y-axis to figure out where it touches so that on that still life itself, so that I would do the same thing on my drawing. So when you do that, using your y-axis and your x-axis, so your vertical axis and your horizontal axis to see where things intersect, then you will get a better idea of placement of objects, because again, you're comparing it to one object to the other. Okay, so here, if again I use my stick and I put it vertically at the edge of that container here, and I see where it intersects on the cube, I know exactly where to place this in relation to the cube. Okay, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's a very good tool to figure out placement. Another thing too that you want to pay attention to is negative space. Okay, so here you don't really have much of an enclosed negative space, but sometimes you have other objects kind of like touching one another at different angles, and you actually have an enclosed negative space. Pay attention to that negative space, because that negative space is helpful in also helping you determine where to place your objects. So if your negative space is a large triangle that you see on your still life, in this case there isn't one, but here you have a little small triangle here, you want to make sure that this negative space here reads the same as that negative space in that still life object. So then again, you can make sure that the position of this jar with the side of the cube is correct. All right, especially if the negative space reads the same as the one that you see in front of you in the still life. Okay, and the other thing that we did was we covered also while I was sketching, I talked about perspective. So here, this cube is in 2-point perspective. This corner here is parallel to us. The width and the depth seems to be sort of moving away from us and will ultimately converge at 2 vanishing points on the horizon line or your eye level. Okay, and how do you determine your eye level? Again, in drawing one, you will learn that if you take a pencil or you take a stick and you place it just in front of your eyes, with your arms outstretched, locked at the elbow, just in front of your eyes. And my eye level is obviously pretty low here. So this would determine your eye level. Why is it important to know where your eye level is because you want to make sure that when you draw the still life, your drawing will turn out as if you're viewing the entire still life at one eye level. Meaning that you want to make sure that everything is drawn correctly, that it's sitting at the correct level that it should be. Okay, and what does that mean? It means that sometimes when you're drawing, you realize that one object would look like it's at a view being viewed at a different eye level as compared to the rest of the still lifes. So it means that you could have been moving up and down as you when you were drawing, and that won't make sense, because ultimately what what happened is that you had created different eye levels for one same object. I mean, with one same still life. Okay, so please make sure that you pay attention where your eye level is. That anything that sits below your eye level, like this cube is below my eye level, I can see the top of that cube. The further away from my eye level, I will see more of that cube. So anything that's at my eye level, I will only see just the edge of the object itself. Okay, so the eye level is also really important. And then again, perspective, pay attention to whether it's 1 point, 2 point, 3 point perspective. And I've gone in and I've drawn out these sort of lines to show you that they will recede towards the two vanishing points at your eye level or the horizon line. Okay. All right. Notice that when I sketched out this drawing, I used my HB charcoal pencil. Oh no, I'm sorry, my white charcoal pencil that doesn't have a grade, but it's fairly soft. Make sure that it's always sharp. And when I was sketching this out, it's really light marks. So you can barely see the marks, and I'm really constructing it. Paying attention to vertical, horizontal edges, paying attention to relationships, and so on and so forth. But sketch lightly and sketch quickly, and make sure that you measure out your proportions. Make sure you figure out your angles, and you know how to do that, like in the last few videos that you had seen, or the things that you've learned in drawing one, how to get the angles of your say the angles of your objects by using that sort of the clock method. That's one of them. Okay. Okay, what else? So very quickly, I just sketched it out, and then the next one, I'm going to show you how to go about shading it. All right, but make sure that when you're sketching out, things are gesture. Draw as if the objects are transparent. Okay, so that you are constructing it. Make sure that you draw it that as if it's transparent, so that you could see the objects behind it. It's always easier, for example, to draw a whole ellipse than to draw a half ellipse. Draw a whole ellipse and then erase the part that you don't want. So very quickly before we end here, that something at an angle like this, please make sure that at the end the ellipse sits at a 90 degree with the middle axis. Okay, then your ellipse will be correct placement in relationship to the object. Okay,